Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the best and one of the worst performances of Beethoven's Eroica, the Third Symphony, the heroic, the one that has probably the most historical afflatus attached to it. And I'm very, very conflicted about this symphony. It's not anything like my favorite. In some ways, I don't care for it at all. I can appreciate a great performance of it and even love it when the performance is really, really terrific. And the ones that I'm going to list make me love it. But I think the work has some real problems. And those problems are not so much as cannot be resolved by an amazing performance by an amazing conductor with an amazing orchestra. All of that can go away, and magically the piece can appear in pristine form as the masterpiece it is, fully formed from the head of Zeus, as it were. But most of the time, it sounds terrible. It's just boring. And the reason is because it has some real, I think, defects. You may disagree, but let's talk about what they are, because I think it's fun and it's a little bit controversial and challenging. And you can agree with me or disagree. First of all, one of the things that I dislike the most about this symphony is not even the music. It has nothing to do with the music. It has to do with all of the iconography that surrounds it. Yes, Beethoven originally wanted to call it Bonaparte. And yes, he crossed out the dedication. And yes, he was inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. All of those things are true. But what do they tell us about the music? See, what most people take away from it and what most written commentary, says about it. And when it comes to that, I have to see the new t-shirt here? Talk less, listen more. That really applies to this symphony, even if I talk now for 40 minutes. I mean, the literature on it is so vast, but so much of what's said is just so irrelevant to the experience of listening to it. Most people come away, or most of the time what's talked about is how revolutionary the symphony is, as if we know what revolutionary music sounds like. Now, the big problem with the revolutionary concept is that, the music does not sound revolutionary to us now. Not a bit. It's long. Yes, it's very long. And it has its interesting bits that are kind of surprising possibly. But after Beethoven, if you listen to Mahler or Bruckner or Strauss or the late Tchaikovsky, Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, you cannot say that there is anything in the symphony that's going to strike a listener today as particularly radical. And since none of us were around in the French Revolution, at the time of the French Revolution, we don't even know what revolutionary music sounded like. And so we have nothing to compare it to. And so the whole idea is ridiculous. What we can take away from the musical substance of the work as it applies to Beethoven's original concept is what music can do. That is, he originally called it Bonaparte. It's music about a person. It encapsulates a personality. It's about human beings. It's about human emotions. Universalized, of course. It's not about this guy. But originally, that's what inspired Beethoven. So, yeah, in that sense, it is an avowedly humanistic work. And that was, not really new, because all music up to that point was based on human voice and expressed human emotions, basically, unless it was pictorial. So that wasn't too new, but it's the scale of it in Beethoven that was new. And that, of course, we can hear because it's a very long symphony. It's really very simple. But the other thing that the symphony does, I think, is that it encapsulates an emotional range, which for purely instrumental music was vastly wider than had ever been attempted before. The difference between the heroic aspect of the First Symphony and its lyrical, beautiful themes, and then the blackness of the Funeral March, which was quite simply the darkest piece of music, written up to that point. The only thing I think that really compares in terms of of sadness and darkness to the funeral march of the Eroica is the opening chorus of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. That has something of the same character, that just unbelievably sad, incredibly sad, dark, but motive, moving, inevitably moving forward. The two pieces share that, I think, a little bit. And then you have the scherzo, which is light and fluffy, and you have the giddy finale, or at least parts of the finale are giddy, parts of it are quite learned and very humorous. So there is just an unbelievable range of emotion in this work. And to me, given where it stands in Beethoven's output, it isn't surprising that he hadn't quite figured out how to integrate all of that into a really satisfying and unified whole. Because I don't need to tell you, there's so many performances of this symphony that are only successful in bits. The first movement's great. The funeral march is too slow. The scherzo is, the finale falls flat. It's not an easy symphony to conduct. It's not an easy symphony to encapsulate whole. And I don't think that's entirely the fault of the performers. I mean, ultimately it is, because you can do it, but the difficulty is Beethoven's. It really is Beethoven's, and he doesn't make it easy for them. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out. Structurally speaking, you have two massive movements. I mean, if you take the repeat of the first movement, you've got 35 minutes of music with the funeral march, basically 20 minutes plus 15 on average, maybe even more. And then you've got this zippy little scherzo that's 5 or 6 minutes long, and then a finale that's generally 11 or 12. It's easier to think of the piece, formally speaking, as in three parts: the first movement, the funeral march, and the last two as a unit. And in fact, some performances play them, run on, attacca, as they say in the biz, starting the finale immediately after the scherzo, which I think is stupid and makes no sense, because that's not the way Beethoven wrote it. And he was very capable of joining movements together when he wanted them to be joined together. But no, the problem is, again, those last two movements. They are such a radical change of character from what came before. And, classical symphonies were known. I mean, the form of the classical symphony, which Beethoven is following, is that of a big, complicated first movement and then a progressive relaxation. The problem is that the funeral march is not relaxed at all. It's not a progressive relaxation after the first movement. It's even darker and more intense than the first movement. And so the balance of the classical symphony, where you start with the biggest thing and slowly release the tension and wind up with a zippy, usually happy finale, or at least an appropriate finale in a lighter form, isn't followed in the Eroica. And it wasn't until Beethoven got to the Fifth Symphony that he really figured out a new way of approaching what he was trying to do, I think, in the Eroica, which is throw the whole weight of the thing onto the finale, while still having a complex, intellectually meaningful sonata allegro first movement. But the Fifth is a finale symphony. It's a symphony that's absolutely headed toward the end. The Eroica isn't headed toward the end. You say what you will about it, the end is not where it's going. So that's sort of the second issue. And again, it can be resolved in a fabulous performance, but it's not easy because the problem is inherent in the work itself. Finally, the third issue that I really have with this symphony is that the orchestration is too small for the work. Conceptually, Beethoven only has a third horn, otherwise it's a standard classical orchestra, and he hadn't quite learned how to orchestrate yet. He really hadn't. You think about it, we just assume people are going to write pieces for orchestra. They're just going to know how to do it. Well, no, it doesn't happen that way. They need to practice. They need to hear what they've done. They need to revise. They need to tinker. Beethoven did not have much of that opportunity. And so I really think the Eroica sounds too small for the strain that Beethoven puts on the orchestra. That's why, for example, you should always add the trumpet part at the coda of the first movement, where it drops out halfway through the first theme. That's just insane. It's insane to do that. It's crazy. I mean, it needs to have the main theme blasted out by the trumpets. All of it. The fact that a valve trumpet in Beethoven's day couldn't do it, or he didn't have one, or whatever, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference. The music is screaming for it, and it sounds so silly without it. It's just terrible. And there are other things like that, little amendations you can make to make it sound fuller and to give the music a little bit more body so it doesn't sound so wiry. It's particularly a problem with period instrument performances because they make it sound even smaller. Yes, they may be fast and they may be loud and they may have the orchestra going crazy all the time all over it, but that doesn't give it the sense of fullness and bigness, and there should be an effortless majesty to so much of the music that's very, very hard to realize. Even with a modern orchestra, it's difficult to realize. Even when you double all the winds, you can do all kinds of things. Again, it's inherent in the piece. One of the biggest problems is the coda of the finale. Those last chords, blap, blap. I mean, how often did they just sound out of tune and unsatisfying because of the way that they're spaced? It's just not great orchestration, not of the kind Beethoven was going to achieve later. I mean, if you listen to the Fourth Symphony, which is a smaller orchestra, it sounds incomparably more full, more, larger and more properly spread out and distributed, and so the sound is fuller all the way through. And this is something that I don't even see this as something that you can argue. I mean, it's a question of fact. Just play that and play this and listen to the difference. To me, it's an obvious thing. And so, yes, there needs to be a lot of care in the handling of the orchestra. It's a piece that requires a lot of rehearsal, which it normally doesn't get today because people think it's easy for orchestras today. It's not hard, technically not hard. And so they just do it. But the truth is, if you really want to do it well, you have to really take unbelievable care over things like balance and accent and phrasing, all of those standard things. But they are acute problems in this of all symphonies, and they are often not resolved. And so, before we get to the recordings that I've chosen, I also want to give you a few musical examples of just how I feel the discussion of the Eroica has misled us into what we really should expect of it. Now, one of the things, I have 3 examples here I'm going to play you, and they all come from this fabulous performance that's one of the 12, the Paul Kletzki Czech Philharmonic one, which is just magnificent, as are really all the performances in this cycle. I'm so happy that we get to use samples from it. Now, one of the things everybody talks about is the harmonic cloud that passes over the first movement, over the first theme. Do, 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 do. And then the violins go in, on a foreign note. Now, even someone like Tovey said, whatever you remember in the symphony, pay attention to that note, because it's going to give rise to the most astonishing harmonic episode in the whole history of Western music in the recapitulation. Well, does it? Let me play you the opening, that little bit, followed by a 1-second pause, followed by the moment of recapitulation where it returns. And you can judge for yourself just how radical that really is. Here you go. Not a bit. Not a bit. What is really going on there? What's going on? Leonard Bernstein, in his discussion of the symphony, actually identified what's going on there. The purpose of that foreign note is that it temporarily suspends the music. You know, it's moving along, do 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 do, and the theme is cut off. It's interrupted, and that dissonance comes in, and then it just goes on its merry way. And the whole point is that Beethoven is telling us very, very early on that there will be disruptions. And that is worked out in the rest of the movement quite brilliantly with, as a genius will. And that's quite useful. But does it sound radical? Do we listen to it and scratch our heads and go, no, we don't. I mean, people today were used to a level of dissonance that this symphony almost never approaches. And we don't have that same kind of long-term harmonic thinking. I mean, people in Beethoven's day didn't have it either. They didn't understand it any more than anyone else. What people like Tovey are talking about is purely theoretical. That's all it is. It's music theory. It's harmonic theory on paper, not your experience of listening to the music in real time. And what happens in the recapitulation, as you heard, is that it gets diverted. It gets diverted harmonically someplace very far away. And we don't realize how far away it is until it gradually tries to get back and passes through a whole pile of different harmonies and keys on the way to the loud outburst that tells us that we are actually back in E flat major, and the theme is home. And it's only there very briefly because then it automatically goes off again. So that was really, it's a fascinating passage. It's a brilliant passage. I love it personally. It's interesting, and the recapitulation is brilliant and thrilling and all that. But do you come away with it thinking that's the only thing in the symphony that matters? Or rather, do you come away from the symphony thinking, wow, that was really something because it had highs, it had lows, it had happiness, it had sadness, it had triumph, it had tragedy, it had joking, it had, right? It's not about what Tovey said. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing, excuse me, the other thing that always pisses me off is that moment just before the recapitulation. The one that everyone says is the most radical moment in the whole symphony, where the strings are playing a pianissimo, really, really soft triple piano. I know it's very, very soft. Tremolo on a dominant seventh chord or something like that. And the horn comes in with the main theme prematurely. It clashes. The key of E flat clashes with the key that the strings are holding. And so it's dissonant. And everyone just goes, oh my God, that was so daring. It's so incredible. And actually, in Beethoven's day, people did think it was incredible. People thought it was so bizarre that they actually corrected the harmony. They thought it was a mistake because nobody would write a clash that basic. But of course, the reason they corrected it is because they weren't listening to it on the orchestra. They were listening to it in piano reductions and piano scores where everything is on the same plane of tone. So you've got the tremolo and the piano and the horn on top, and they're right next to each other on the keyboard. They're all tangled up, going do do do, this like this. And I mean, yeah, sure, it's very dissonant on the piano. Well, it's much more dissonant on the piano than it would be in the orchestra, because in the orchestra you've got two different instruments, totally different planes of tone, different dynamics, and it's not dissonant to arias at all. And it doesn't sound accidental, and it doesn't sound like a mistake. And unless someone said to you, that's the moment, the Eroica moment, you wouldn't think twice about it. You just think, oh, what a wonderfully poetic moment, because now I know the recapitulation is coming. And sure enough, a second later, it arrives just as predicted, and it sounds positively inevitable, and there's no shock there. There's no shock at all. I mean, it just doesn't, so what we're told we should be feeling, bottom line, is not what we should be feeling. And then, with all of the nonsense pointing out the things that we ought to be amazed at, which don't sound amazing at all, listen to this business in the middle of the development. Now, this is amazing, and no one ever talks about it. It's that fabulous pile up. It sounds like a foggy day on the New Jersey Turnpike with a 25 truck catastrophe. Here it is. Now that is revolutionary. That is radical. That is a moment of extraordinary expressive tension. That you may remember. I've never forgotten it. The first time I heard it, I just went, wow. But why aren't people letting us have the wow moments that really are wow moments for us, for modern listeners? And, it's fabulous also how people, I know I'm going on way too long, but I can't help it. Isn't it fabulous how all of these scholars tell us what people in Beethoven's day thought and were hearing and how they responded to it and what they said about it? Could there possibly be more bullshit? We have no idea what those people thought. We have no idea what they responded to. All we know is that the first performance, they wanted it to stop. They thought it was too big and too long. And they were probably right. It was probably a horrible performance, which broke down and had to be restarted. It probably just sucked. So, those are all the things about the Eroica that I find problematic. And for all of those reasons, and I talk about them, by the way, again, in my Beethoven book, which is now out, which you can all buy if you want, Beethoven's Complete Orchestral Music Discussed. But, these are the things that I find concerning. And they're issues that I think so many people who interpret this symphony never come to grips with or even think about or even realize are actual issues. It's so much easier to simply parrot the usual story, the usual cant, and just like lemmings, witless little lemmings, fall in line and have everybody go, oh yes, the Eroica. Well, let me tell you something. It's okay not to like it. It's okay to have your issues with it. It's okay to be very picky about the performances that you prefer, which I certainly am, because I have no patience for this symphony in a bad performance or one that I don't like. And speaking of bad performances, I just want to tell you the most awful one in the world. It's very simple. Jascha Horenstein's on Vox. It is absolutely the stiffest, most expressionless, most flat-footed Eroica I have ever heard in my life. It is loathsome. It is vile. Avoid it at all costs. And we've gotten that out of the way. Now let's talk about the great ones. I already said Paul Kletzki with the Czech Philharmonic. You've heard some samples. You hear how fabulously clear it is with its incredibly audible bass lines and the wonderful woodwinds and the amazing clarity of rhythm. It's just fabulous, but never in the sort of period instrument style of becoming hysterical and over the top and as though the instruments are about to fly to pieces. Some people like that. I don't. This is stylized music. It's ritualized music. If Beethoven wanted the whole orchestra to go to pieces, and he would have told them to go to pieces. He had no trouble telling people to do things that they didn't like to do and make sounds that they never made before. But ultimately, this is intense and fabulous. So, Kletzki, that's a great one. Now, the rest of these, I've sort of loosely organized. They're really in no order of preference until we get to the very end, of course. But essentially, I've broken them down into a few bits. First, we're talking about old school historical recordings. And the old school historical recordings generally come in two bits. There's the old school German style and the old school Toscanini style. And so we should start with the Toscanini style with Toscanini. Who did it better? The Toscanini style was the one that became really the standard way of playing the symphony. but very few people did it as well as Toscanini. And this is his last recorded performance. It dates from 1952. He recorded this more than any other symphony, I think, like 5 or 6 times. I don't know. In the edition itself, there are at least 3 performances of it, I think. It was his specialty, one of his real specialty works. And this is taut and exciting as hell, and intense, just incredible tension goes through the whole symphony, and it's very well recorded. Even though it's mono, 1952, it's really, really a beautiful performance. It was a broadcast, 1953. Don't pay attention to me. I always get these things wrong, these dates wrong. But this was 53. And like I said, Toscanini was about 137 at that point. It was his last performance of it. And it is magnificent, a wonderful testament to his love of the work and to his gifts as a conductor, and it should be in everybody's collection. So, Toscanini, definitely one of the old school historical greats, and we are so lucky we have it, because Toscanini was born really 30 years after Beethoven died. So we're not talking about an interpretation that's that far from the great man himself. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, there is the old school German variety of interpretation, and that is Furtwängler. Yes, Furtwängler, and I know some of you may be shocked that I recommend a Furtwängler performance, but Furtwängler's Eroica was also a testament to how he felt about the universe and music, because everything he did was a testament to how he felt about the universe. And he thought that the universe revolved around, of course, German music and therefore around him more specifically. But his Eroicas were pretty good. They were really good. The thing with Furtwängler, and it's always an issue, is that because he did not live to really authorize all of these air checks we have of him doing this stuff to be released, there's just tons of it, and so much of it is dreck, because you never knew what you were going to get with Furtwängler. One of the best Eroicas, I think, comes from like 1952. I think it was December 8th, something like that, 1952. It's on Tara, and he did it a day before, December 7th. And the one on the 8th is magnificent, and the one on the 7th is boring. That's what it was with him. So you have to wallow through all kinds of garbage in order to find the pearls. And people who love Furtwängler, they like even his garbage. They think that, because it's him, the garbage is meaningful. And I don't believe in that. I think garbage is garbage and great stuff is great stuff. So I did it. I went through all of the stuff. I have all these recordings in multiple versions. It's not worth it, I think. I really think. But the great ones are great and should be heard and deserve to be heard. They are weighty and serious and grim, and better in the first 2 movements possibly than the last 2, because humor was never his specialty. But still, this is his wartime version. This is 1944, Vienna Philharmonic, 43, pardon me, December 19th and 20th, 1944, I was right. With the Vienna Philharmonic. The sound, this is Tara, this version of it. It's available in 100 different formats. The sound is surprisingly good, and wow, was it a tremendous performance, full of that tension and angst and emotional truth, I think, that Furtwängler achieved at his absolute best. So this is a wonderful performance, and I could recommend it accordingly if you're interested in historical recordings. The last historical recording we have to have is Erich Kleiber with the Concertgebouw. I think he did the Eroica. Didn't he do it twice? I was going to look before the talk, but I got so wrapped up in doing all these other things I forgot to check. But yeah, he did it a couple times. But this is his Concertgebouw recording, the first one he did, if there are 2. And you'll tell me in a second if I've misremembered this. One of these symphonies he did twice. Maybe it was the Pastoral. No, I think it was the Eroica. Oh, who cares? This is the one with the Concertgebouw. The Concertgebouw was a great Eroica orchestra. They're going to pop up again very, very shortly. But Erich Kleiber was, of course, a great Beethovenian in the Toscanini mold. He was not a Furtwänglerian, but he did have, I think, something of the German or Viennese sort of, a little bit of that lilt, which maybe tamed some of the rhythmic ferocity that Toscanini was so famous for. Some people, of course, prefer the ferocity, but Kleiber is a genius, and it's a great, great Eroica, and it sounds pretty damn good for 1950. It's on Decca, and it's also in the Kleiber box, of course, which is maybe the only place you can find it now. Erich Kleiber is an Eroica guy that you really must hear. So, those are the historical Eroicas. Now we're going to talk about the period instrumenty Eroicas. And I have 3 of those as well. The first, now I actually confess, none of these are on period instruments as far as I know. They're modern instruments played in period style. So maybe that's cheating a little. I just think it sounds better. I think that the piece needs it. It needs the weight of sonority. You have to compensate for some of that spindliness that Beethoven hadn't quite worked out of his system when he wrote this piece. Can you imagine what it would have sounded like with Snickerdoodle? I mean, doing it? Oh my God, Snickerdoodle did do it, didn't he? With single strings. Holy cow. I hope you saw that video. It sounds like what you might expect it sounded like. Oh, talk about a bunch of people who didn't give a damn what the challenges were or what the issues were in performing the symphony, with reasonable sympathy and intelligence. Anyway, Thomas Dausgaard with the Swedish Chamber Orchestra, and this is really, really a fine series. It's all of Beethoven's orchestral music. And what I really, really love about this particular performance is the couplings, because you get the Eroica in a wonderful performance. It's typical period instrument style. It's quick and exciting, but it's not relentless, and it's not breathless, and it's not, it's not one of those things where it sounds like it's on autopilot. It's not robotic. But you also get the 12 contradances without opus 14. Yes, is that it? These 12 contradances have in the middle of them the origin of the theme of the finale of the Eroica Symphony. So they're wonderful to hear, and you get the original tune in its original source, and you get from his incidental music to Leonora Prohaska, the Funeral March, which actually came from Piano Sonata number 26. But again, you get a different take on the Funeral March, Topos, which of course we also have in the Eroica Symphony. So these couplings really shed light on Beethoven's approach to both, the finale of the symphony and the second movement of the symphony. And you also get the 2 violin romances as an extra bonus. But it really is one of those couplings which is, more than the sum of its parts. And that to me makes it very intelligently planned and rather special. It's on Simax. It may not be available anymore. If it is available, it's probably very expensive, but it's a wonderful performance and a wonderful disc, a wonderful program. And we see so few wonderful programs these days, Next, oh yes, Paavo Järvi. Oh, this is hot, with a fabulous 8th Symphony too. This is with the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen. And boy, are they hot, hot, hot in this performance. Again, if you're going to have a period instrument style performance, what the instruments lack in basic weight of sonority, you have to make up for in terms of accuracy, accent, and ensemble balance. And it has to be done in such a way that the music never sounds mechanical or running on autopilot. And Järvi, this is a wonderful Beethoven cycle. I mean, I've talked about some of it before. So this is fabulous and definitely worth hearing. It's on RCA. Yeah. And if you can still get it, that's the other period. But here is the real kicker. If you're into the period instrument, Beethoven's metronome markings and all that stuff approach, Scherchen. Scherchen, you get the combination of historical performance, because it's in mono, and really historical performance, historically informed performance, because it's insanely fast. It's at Beethoven's metronome markings. It's totally unlike any other Eroica you've ever heard. And Scherchen was one of those guys who is even more authentic than these people, because these people are very, very careful to have superb instrumental playing recorded under optimal conditions. Scherchen didn't care about any of that. He took his orchestra, which is like, I don't know, whatever this group is for this particular Vienna State Opera Orchestra, I think, or one of those people, and they were never very good. It was sort of the pieces of the Vienna Philharmonic on an off day, and he just played them, drove them to despair. And so this has all of the ragged edges that people who like some Beethoven with their ragged edges will just adore, because it is pretty rough and ready in places. But I have to say, with Scherchen, the roughness and readiness all seems to serve the musical expression. It's not this sort of conceptual roughness and readiness. It's roughness and readiness that comes from the fact that the music is really raw and edgy. And this is a really raw and edgy Eroica in period style, in the early days of period style. It's on Deutsche Grammophon now, but it was on Tara and on 500 of Scribendum. It's on a million labels. Do hear Scherchen's Eroica. It's a kick. It's just a kick. So, there. Now, we're going to go back to the modern versions of the more Furtwänglerian or heavy-duty German approach. And of course, the acme of the heavy-duty German approach was Klemperer, who did it twice. There's a mono one and a stereo one. And some people like the mono one better because it's a little faster, and I can understand that. But Klemperer, unlike Furtwängler, Klemperer was a more well-rounded musical personality in that, first of all, he loved woodwinds, which is a fabulous thing in this symphony, and in Beethoven generally. But he had a sense of humor, a sardonic and somewhat embittered sense of humor, maybe. But he gets the third movement and the finale. He gets the wit somehow, the perkiness of them, even though the tempos are quite moderate, in a way that Furtwängler probably never could. So Klemperer's Eroica is sort of the acme of that heavy-duty German approach. Karl Böhm did it that way too, but he was a lot stuffier. He didn't have the sense of humor. Klemperer had it. And so these are fantastic performances. Again, it is so different from anybody else. I hope you're beginning to see, as I go through these performances, what I'm emphasizing is that because Beethoven called the symphony Bonaparte or Bonaparte or whatever it was, it's about personality. It's about the emotions expressed by personality. It's about characterizing. And the performances I love the most are the ones that have the most character. And say what you will about Klemperer, fast or slow, he was a character. And a character which is not inimical to the actual expressive point of the music. I mean, it has to be a character that goes with what Beethoven wants to express. But boy, did he have it. And not only that, but these are right here. So I can put this away without straining. So that's Klemperer. And also, though, this is a real sleeper. This is a real sleeper. This is a wonderful, wonderful performance that I was so thrilled to hear. It's released on the Profil label. The Klemperer, of course, is on Warner now, as EMI. It's Tenstedt with the NDR Symphony Orchestra, North German Radio. This is one fabulous, it's a live Eroica. And, the Eroica was one of Tenstedt's big pieces, but he only recorded it, as far as I know, once for EMI toward the very, very end of his career. And it was released, I think, after he died. It was like his last recording for EMI, and it was coupled to Mussorgsky's A Night on Bald Mountain, which, of course, you always want to hear possibly simultaneously with the Eroica. But here, it was with the London Phil, it was so-so. This is great. This is it's an amazing sonic job as well. The sound is so big and rich and full and fantastic, and you hear straight down through the orchestra. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous performance in that classic German tradition with flexibility and gravity and intensity. And if you're a Tenstedt fan, oh my God, you're going to love this. And even if you're not, you're going to love this. This is in the box. There's a Profil Tenstedt box, which has lots of good stuff in it. But it was also released as a single disc. And that's where I reviewed it on ClassicsToday.com, the single disc. It's just tremendous. And what a pleasant and wonderful surprise, because Tenstedt was such a lovable conductor, and his recordings didn't always do him justice. But those of you who love his Mahler will know that his live stuff sometimes could be far more intense than his studio stuff. And this is a live Eroica in that vein. It's just marvelous. So that's great. Now I have three more, which belong in no real category. I think that the Kletzki that I already talked about is one of those performances, because Kletzki's is sharp and rhythmic and it just is what it is. And of course you have the Czech Philharmonic, which brings a personality of a whole nother caliber. And I could talk about, other personality-filled performances, like the Blomstedt with the Staatskapelle Dresden. It's maybe just a mite too tame for some people, but wow, that orchestra, right? I mean, that has its own personality in the best hand. The Schuricht, of course, with the Paris Conservatory. You want the people who play this music, in addition to being superlative musicians, to have their own distinctive personality. The music screams out for it, and that is how you get past some of the disproportion and the wide and not entirely coherent range of moods that Beethoven writes into the music, I think. Because when you recognize the personality that's doing it, a lot of the problems go away. And here is another full of personality and marvelousness, Monteux. Now, he did this twice as well. My preferred one is the Philips recording, which is now on Decca, which is in this box of the Beethoven symphonies, with the Concertgebouw. Again, with the Concertgebouw, the same orchestra Kleiber had, because the Concertgebouw was not only one of the world's greatest orchestras, but it had personality. And a lot of that personality was in the woodwind section, quite similar to the Czech Philharmonic. And that serves the symphony so well. But Monteux is such a different conductor from either Furtwängler or Toscanini. With Monteux, the music just flows. It just goes. Especially the Funeral March. The Funeral March in this performance is one of the greatest I've ever heard in my life. It's just so bloody inevitable. When he finds the right, le mot juste, just the right sonority, the right speed, the right sense of phrase. And it's just incredible. I mean, Monteux could do that. And you're not even conscious of a guy on the podium. You just confront the music as it is, and it's just marvelous. So, Monteux and the Concertgebouw is one of my great Eroicas. And now, one of the more recent ones that I have also mentioned, and which I think is just stunning, and which gives me hope for humanity, because it tells us that great performances are still always possible. And that performance is Honeck with the Pittsburgh Symphony on reference recordings. This is unquestionably one of the great performances. It really is. It is thrilling, fabulously well played, and incredibly intense. And one of the things that was most noteworthy about this was Honeck's particular care with accent, with really making sure that the music moves and that it has that sort of punch, that the rhythm of the first movement never turns into a waltz. The first move is in 3/4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. It should never sound like the Blue Danube. And it doesn't, because Beethoven takes great pains to make sure that the accents don't always fall on the first beat, so it never turns waltzy. And Honeck just really, really nails it. It's fabulous. And one of the things that actually, Honeck, I've been a little hard on him lately because, his other performances have not been so fabulous. They've been a little bit mannered, and he's becoming a little bit narcissistic and self-regarding, as so many conductors have these days. I hope he grows out of it. But, I listened to this originally and wrote a review. Did I write a review? I don't think I did. I think I just listened to it because I liked it so much. I didn't want to write about it. I just wanted to revel in it. And he wrote his own note where he talks about how he paid particular attention to accent. And oh, how I wish he had just shut up and hadn't said anything about it, because I hadn't read it first. I always listen first before I read anything. And, the music speaks for itself. He didn't have to say anything. He doesn't have to say anything. He shouldn't say anything. He should let the magnificence of the performance do its own thing. And it certainly does that. However, there is one iconic performance, and a lot of you already know what it is, that has sort of led the Eroica sweepstakes for such a long time, and rightly so. And that performance is Szell and Cleveland. Yes! Now, first of all, he has the most exciting coda of the finale that anybody has ever done. I think he probably diddled the brass parts a little bit, particularly the horns, but my God, it is so unbelievably well played and so exciting. But this is the performance that triumphantly solves all of the issues with the symphony. It's relatively swift. It has unbelievable balances, incredible transparency of texture, fantastic accents, amazing phrasing. It just gets everything right. He has completely worked out all the problems, and unlike Szell, who could sometimes sound a little bit stiff and mechanical, let's face it, because he was quite dictatorial, there's none of that here. There's none of that here. He catches the flow. And the piece just goes as if self-propelled. And it sounds very good, too. It's a good sounding recording still, even after all these years. So Szell is the pick of the Eroicas. It truly, truly is. But let me tell you, this is one heck of a pile, I think, of these dozen Eroicas. And when we all do our talk things, do me a favor, just as a personal favor. Do not just dig around in your record collection and say, oh, I like this, or I like so-and-so. Nobody wants to know what you have sitting around in your living room. We don't. And let's try and talk about the music a little bit and talk about these performances if you've heard them. And if you've got something that you just have to mention because you just love it so much, okay, I get it. I may delete it, but I get it. It's okay. But I really would like to try and stay focused on the music, the interpretive problems that it presents, and how they are best solved by these performances and by any other performance that you think brings a particular amount of insight to the issue that is the cultural monument known as Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.